get started. I know a couple folks are still going to trickle in, but it's really great to see you all here. Thanks so much for coming, and wonderful to team with Preserve Historic Missoula on this one. It's great to see so many faces that I also just saw some people talk. So a night full of preservation. We are really lucky tonight to have Kate here. She's a member of the historic preservation team at A&E Design. She is a Central Montana native. Has been documenting Montana's grain elevators for over a decade. Through drawings, she's excited to continue exploring. Kate has a Master of Architecture degree from Montana State University. She is joined by Jared Schmitz, who is also with A&E Design in Missoula. He engages in local preservation activity as the president of Preserve Historic Missoula. He's been involved in research at the intersection of architecture and heritage for over 10 years and is currently appointed as faculty specialist at the University of Maryland, where he received his Master of Architecture and Master of Historic Preservation in 2021. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. For anyone joining us online, this is our very first time projecting this out to the world outside of this room. So please forgive any technical difficulties that arise. We will work through them as they do. And without further ado.
Thank you. Well, howdy everyone. We're here today to hopefully give you all some insight into Central Montana's grain elevators and agricultural landscapes. And if nothing else, we just hope to showcase a handful of these stunning vernacular structures. And before getting started though, we just wanted to thank you all. But yeah, we just wanted to thank you all for coming out in support of Preservation Month, and also thank Jeannie for inviting us to be a part of the lecture series, and Preserve Historic Missoula for all they do in town. I'm just gonna leave them up in the corner. So grain elevators are so much more than a utilitarian means to store and convey grain vertically. They are an integral part of the Montana landscape. They provide central points of gathering amidst thousands of acres of farmland. They have become familiar landmarks to the farmer and the traveler, punctuating the seemingly endless horizons. They are the pride of their communities, the heart of their identities.
However important and resilient they are, these structures are not immortal. Hundreds of elevators across the state have been abandoned or demolished since their peak in the mid-20th century. Changes in technology, closures and removals of railroad lines, and consolidation of operations have led these structures to disuse over the years. Disuse quickly becomes disrepair and eventually results in demolition. Our research identified over 40 elevators that were taken down in the last few decades alone. The moments of excitement as we pulled up to the sites of interesting elevators that we were eager to see were crushed when we saw the piles of debris and abandoned foundations. These demolished elevators have left scars in the landscape, many times taking their communities with them, leaving nothing but the shadows of their former selves. Montana's remaining early elevators stand as monuments to a past way of life, a way of life that is not completely gone, but has evolved and has been greatly consolidated over time. Sometimes beautiful in their decay, these ghosts indicate the displacement of communities and stories lost to time.
Although the decline of many elevators has resulted in demolition, communities have rallied around these structures to save them, despite the challenges of adapting them for new uses. So inspiring stories such as plus the mouse again. The grassroots preservation of the test slope in Livingston or the adaptive reuse of the Misco elevator in Bozeman just demonstrate the resiliency of these structures and the drive of their communities to preserve them. So the research that we're here to share with you today diverges a little bit from the work of others, focusing on patterns identified through an extensive survey that we conducted last year, rather than kind of looking at the politics or economics surrounding grain elevators. Instead, we use drawing, photography, and visual analysis to tell a small cross-section of the story of grain elevators in Montana. So our research involved documentation of over 250 elevators across central and western Montana. And we identified these elevators kind of roughly west of Billings as the focus of our fieldwork. And this map here shows, to the best of our knowledge, nearly all of the extant existing grain elevators that are kind of roughly west of that line. And generally, we also included mill, fertilizer, and feed elevators, as these building types were often adapted from grain elevators and took very similar forms. So on our fieldwork excursions, which totaled nearly 3,000 miles of driving, we took over 1,000 photographs and drew dozens of field sketches to conduct the research. And of course, visiting this many elevators meant that our time spent at most of them was very brief, a couple minutes at each, really, honestly. And with many falling either on private or railroad land, we were pretty much limited to what we could see from the road. And of course, in true Montana fashion, Mother Nature had some other plans for our late April fieldwork around the Lewistown area, although it really did result in some delightfully moody photos. Limited archival access also hindered our efforts. Comically, a large number of the photos of Montana's smaller rural towns are actually from the elevators rather than of them.
Cool.
So in this presentation, we'll just give a brief overview of grain storage before it made its way to Montana and discuss the railroads, the role of railroads and grain elevators in the settling of the state. We'll continue on discussing early Montana elevators and their workings in more detail, just painting a picture of kind of the day-to-day operation of these structures. And we'll go on with an explanation of technological shifts, such as improved agricultural equipment and the development of the highway system, and talk about how that informed how elevators evolved and were consolidated over time. And we then focus on some broad patterns that we identified throughout the region, just elaborating on the significance of some of the variations we observed. And we finally conclude with a reflection on the lasting legacy of these structures, just looking ahead at what the future might hold.
Agriculture has played a crucial role in sustaining human life on Earth and is often described as the basis of civilization. Since ancient times, the storage of crops has allowed groups to maintain essential foodstuffs through harsh winters and retain seeds to sow the following year. Grain storage also helped to facilitate the rise of trade between cities. From storage as simple as ancient vessels to the granaries of the Berbers, humans have always been improving ways to store grain. These vernacular structures, borrowing from local building techniques, materials, and traditions, were extremely localized, yet always shared the same basic functions: protecting grain from spoilage, pests, and thieves. Granaries were often raised up off the ground, promoting airflow and protecting from animals and insects. Sometimes they were fortified and built into cliffs to secure food stores from humans as well. Both these granaries in Portugal and England utilized toadstools to deter animals from entering the building. Granaries or silos were often fortified, providing access to foodstuffs in times of war. Early grain storage in the United States mostly took the form of flat storage in warehouses or granaries like these small ones in Fortine and Decker, Montana. Stored grain, that's right. Stored grain, would then be sacked and moved around by hand and wagon on its way to the mill. As time went on, a better means of transporting grain was needed, This is where the grain elevator comes in, a machine that harnessed the power of gravity to handle loose grain in bulk. In the 1780s, Oliver Evans devised a replacement for the manual hoisting of tubs or sacks of grain with a pulley system. Evans' mill elevator consisted of a belt with metal or wood cups that scooped grain vertically up an enclosed chute and deposited it at an upper conveyor. Joseph Dart's 1842 grain elevator in Buffalo, New York, pictured here, is commonly considered the first true grain elevator. This elevator borrowed from Evans' idea to transfer grain from smaller barges that were capable of navigating the Erie Canal to seaworthy ships. After burning in 1863, it was replaced by the Bennett elevator, pictured here on the right. These early elevators were the first of many that brought the fruits of America's farmland to the global market, fueling the Industrial Revolution. By the 1890s, the use of conveyors enabled grain to be transported from a vertical workhouse horizontally through the head house to distant bins. Buffalo's Great Northern Elevator, pictured here, is an outstanding example of this, storing nearly 3 million bushels of grain, making it the largest in the world at the turn of the century.
Yeah, so even with this incredible new technology, taking advantage of the fertile soils of the Great Plains to the west could not have been achieved without a couple of things: people to farm the land and a means to get the grain back east. And the railroad provided both of those. So the rail system in the US exploded in the early 19th century, and railroad companies, namely the Union Pacific, continued to expand westward for the following decades, and eventually reached Montana in the 1880s. And these railroads channeled settlement of the West, notably through the Homestead Act of 1862, which entitled citizens and prospective citizens to 160 acres of land if they established residence and farmed a portion of it for 5 years. So rail lines quickly spread throughout the state, connecting Montana's farmland to the cities and ports to the east. And among some of the earlier smaller routes and branches, the first transcontinental route to cross Montana was the Northern Pacific in 1883. And that was followed by the Great Northern Railway, also known as the High Line, in 1893. And interestingly, in 1905, the Milk River Valley along the High Line was actually projected to be one of the most populous areas in the state. That's not the case today. The final transcontinental route to span Montana was the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, better known as the Milwaukee Road, and that ended up crossing the state in 1908. And of course, in addition to the main lines, there were various spurs and connector lines that just branched off everywhere into the countryside, connecting Montana's small remote communities to the world. And really, these railroads were the foundation of Montana's reputation as a global powerhouse of grain. Homesteaders settled near towns along the railroads with pretty meager means, but had a fiery ambition to make it on their own. And these maps here from 1909 and 1916 highlight some of the lands that were designated for homesteading under the 1909 Enlarged Homestead Act, which doubled the potential homestead size to 320 acres and shortened that required prove-up period to a short 3 years. And land that was previously mostly used for ranching or occupied by reservations became available and was really highly desired for farming. And the established townships were divided into quarter and half sections as seen in this homestead plat. And this is still evident in the landscape today, as you can see with fields there. Again, Montana's early homesteaders often arrived in the state with very little and just kind of made do with what was available to them. And often the bare land didn't include really any trees or access to water, which made building homes and growing crops pretty difficult. So their modest homes and outbuildings were made from anything from lumber or logs to locally sourced sod or even stone at times. And of course, most of their work was put into the land itself, cultivating and nurturing their crops. So this bar graph here on the left highlights in red how land in Montana utilized for farming grew along with settlement. And these are kind of red bottom to top. And also on the right, we have the wheat acreage relative to other crops that were grown in the state. And that really just shows like how quickly wheat became the dominant crop in Montana. And this 1926 map here shows the distribution of land where spring wheat was cultivated. So it's all little dots there, just in relation to the rail lines. And we can just see that this impressive scale of cultivation was really made possible by the railroads and the homesteaders that settled these areas.
Early homesteaders largely sustained themselves off of their own land and sold their excess grain crop as their primary means of income. Early farming in Montana was backbreaking work requiring long days in the field and constant determination. Let's talk about the process of grain farming. First, the virgin soils of the plains needed to be broken with horse, oxen, or later tractor-driven plows. Although water was an important resource to successfully growing a fruitful crop, many early farmers could not afford to irrigate, and around 3/4 of wheat grown in the state at the turn of the century was done without irrigation. Government promises to irrigate the large areas of land mostly never panned out, and many farmers eventually took matters into their own hands by forming cooperatives. With the land ready to be cultivated, the fields were sown with wheat, barley, oats, or flax. Again, although other crops were grown, we will mostly focus on Montana's most abundant crop. The fields were tended by homesteaders until their crops were ready for harvest. With many homesteads lacking access to irrigation, the yield of the crop was at the mercy of Mother Nature. The first stages of harvest included reaping or binding. Reaping, or cutting the stalks from the ground, was done by hand with a sickle or scythe early on, but quickly transitioned to horse-drawn reapers. The cut grain stalks were then bound with twine into bundles called shocks. Shocks of grain would then be left to dry in the landscape, and would sometimes be gathered to a single location in preparation for threshing. Threshing involved beating, flailing, or otherwise smacking the cut and dried grain stalks to loosen the grain kernels from the plant. The final step of winnowing separated the chaff, small pieces of husk, and other dirt or debris from the grain. Some threshing machines, such as the one on the right, combined these processes. The loose grain mostly ended up in granaries on early homesteads, where it would eventually be sacked and transported by wagon directly to rail cars. Many of these early structures remain a part of the landscape today.
So the process of sacking and moving grain by hand and wagon to rail cars was, as you can imagine, extremely arduous, and a more efficient means of handling the bulk grain was needed. And this is where that elevator technology that we talked about that developed in Buffalo comes in, and we finally start talking about Montana grain elevators about a third of the way through the presentation here. So, of course, early wood elevators weren't unique to Montana and propagated westward across the plains with the development of the railroad. And by the time they'd reached Montana, they were largely the same as any of the other ones you could find from New York to the Dakotas. And the early elevators that were scattered across America's farmland, they almost all shared a common wood construction and the familiar gable roof forms of the lower workhouse and the raised head house. And Montana elevators were no exception to this. These late 19th and early 20th century structures typically stood anywhere from 50 to 80 feet tall and held anywhere from 20 to 50,000 bushels. They were built with newly standardized lumber that was distributed by rail rather than locally milled timbers. And the construction technique of cribbing was generally utilized to overcome the great downward and outward forces of the grain. So cribbing was simply just stacking up a bunch of boards flat on top of each other with lapping ends and then spiking them together with nails. And rising upward, these solid walls became narrower and narrower toward the top until 2x4s were being used. And as Montana's railroads were developed after cribbing was popularized, most elevators in the state were cribbed. So an alternate form of construction was balloon framing, which is more of a traditional stud construction with these horizontal wood bands tied together with steel tie rods. And as I said, as the railroads came to the state after cribbing was popularized, most elevators in the state were cribbed, and we actually didn't see any balloon frame elevators within the central or western half of the state. Early on, the elevators were clad in clapboard siding. This was often painted either in red or white. And then lettering would then be stenciled on and painted with a brush to identify the elevator. Internally, these common country elevators functioned pretty similarly to those first ones that we talked about on the water in Buffalo, but they had a slightly altered design to accept grain from wagons through dumping and then deposit it into rail cars rather than barges. So in the most simplified version of this process, the grain would be brought in bulk by wagon into the drive shed and the receiving scale, where the wagon would then be weighed and have its contents dumped into the grain pit. So in the pit, the grain would then be scooped up by the buckets of the leg and carried up to the head house way up at the top, where it would be dispensed at the distribution floor through the turn head distributor there in the middle. That was controlled by the elevator operator, the little wheel over there down in the workhouse. And finally, when the rail cars were ready to be loaded, each bin would be emptied into a hopper scale to weigh the grain, which in turn dumped back into the pit, and then the grain would go up the leg yet again, sometimes for the third or fourth time after it's been at the elevator, and was distributed to the loading spout and back into a rail.
A typical day for a grain elevator operator and his crew could sometimes get a little busy, like this day in Big Sandy during harvest. Smaller elevators typically had 1 or 2 employees, but larger elevators could have 5 or more, including managers, operators, truck drivers, and bookkeepers. Early in the morning, boxcars delivered on a siding track the previous day would be coopered or boarded up so that they could accept grain and hold it for the bumpy trip. This involved using a combination of boards and sheet materials such as reinforced cardboard or tar paper to seal the boxcars for the journey. Throughout the day, the rail cars would be loaded in between deliveries of grain at a rate of about 10 to 12, 2,000 bushel cars per day. An important job at the elevator was keeping records of what came and what went. Managers or bookkeepers would note the weight of every wagon before and after dumping, which bin the grain went into, the grade of the grain, and what was loaded in boxcars, all while making sure operations were running smoothly and safely. Elevators typically charged a fixed fee per bushel for weighing, receiving, elevating, grading, and insuring for a set amount of time, and then a nominal fee for each additional day. To add to all of this, most elevators provided additional goods and services known as sidelines. Goods sold included sacks and twine, livestock, fertilizer, farm implements, and other general merchandise. Sometimes services such as grain cleaning or sacking were provided. Sidelines allowed elevators to diversify their income and utilize their facilities throughout the year rather than mostly around harvest. In addition to elevators being a focal point of agriculture and settlement, they were also a center of rural Montana life in many ways. Elevators provided a place for farmers to congregate, swap stories, and connect with each other. They hosted everything from late night card games in the office to children's games of tag while their parents conducted business. Grain elevators sit at the center of Montana's agricultural landscapes, each supporting thousands of acres of farmland. Elevators supported an average of 100 members each in 1935. Montana's rural landscapes can be understood as an intertwined patchwork of farmland and collection points. At a small scale, farmers' fields supply their granaries. At a larger scale, the landscape is a quilt of farms and homesteads that supply the elevators of central towns. Towns, which often centered on elevators, were formed every 5 to 10 miles, striking a balance between the distance farmers could deliver grain in a day by wagon and minimizing the number of stops trains would have to make. Town speculators also wanted to ensure that their investments wouldn't be undermined by nearby competitors. This resulted in the rhythm that is apparent in the landscape today, as seen in this portion of the High Line. Grain elevators were another commonplace building in nearly every rural Montana town. as ordinary as a store or a church. They were centers of commerce, social life, and activity, just like any other business. In addition to elevators, small rail towns housed everything from diners and post offices to banks, churches, depots, schools, and stores. These structures supported the daily lives of locals just as the elevators did.
So as the countryside populated, a few different types of elevators emerged along Montana's railroads, with the two main categories being country and terminal elevators. So country elevators are those smaller, more familiar forms that dot the landscape. They're often the first stop for grain after it departs a farmer's field or granary, and they can be broken down into three main types: independent, line, and cooperative elevators. And these types are really defined more by their ownership rather than their form or function. And speaking of ownership, elevators were not actually owned by rail companies, as antitrust laws prevented that. So independent elevators, which you can kind of see actually behind the Dutton Farmers Elevator Code, it's R.L. Worley independent elevator there. They were built by individual farms that produced enough grain to support owning their own elevator, which allowed them to avoid the commercial elevator fees. And it also allowed them to strategically hold their grain either until winter or even spring to fetch a better price. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have line elevators. Line elevators were chains of elevators that were controlled by a single entity, usually a large grain mill or corporation. And these elevators sometimes operated for shorter seasons around harvest, as they didn't have that same incentive to hold the grain as they kind of pushed it along to the mill. One example of this was the Montana Elevator Company, which incorporated in 1889, and they built many of the first elevators in Montana. The intensive use of their standardized plan is why a lot of the elevators that you see on the Milwaukee Road and Northern Pacific lines all look pretty much the same. And somewhere in between were cooperative elevators or farmers elevators, which were a response to the perceived monopolies of the line elevator corporations. They were formed by collective groups of farmers and businessmen. They shared in the profits, and they each had one vote in the operation of the business. And often these cooperatives were formed locally by the communities they were in the case of the Molt and Broadview Farmers Elevator companies. And the coexistence of these three types of country elevators in really kind of close competition with each other is why it's common to see more than one elevator in many of Montana's small rural towns. And also, as there was kind of a lot of turnover and changing of things, it's also kind of evidenced by their signage. It's pretty uncommon to see an elevator that only has one name on it. The second category of elevators is terminal elevators. These are the large elevators that primarily receive grain from smaller elevators, and then there they would clean, sort, blend, treat, store, and eventually ship the grain out. And these centers of trade are the largest facilities, often including more than one leg and featuring capacities well over 1 million bushels. And much of Montana's grain ended up in elevators to the east, like what's it called? It's on here. The Farmers Union Grain Terminal, which is over in Minneapolis. Montana also had a few of its own terminal elevators. The elevator in Great Falls is one of the more well-known ones, and it held around 1.5 million bushels. Twin elevators in Lewistown and Shelby also served a terminal function, kind of on either end of the High Line there. I guess Lewistown's down south. But subterminal or collector elevators were kind of this in-between type of elevator, and they fell somewhere in between the country and terminals. They're an intermediate step between the two, generally defined by their ability to load at least half a train's cars from their stores. And they kind of provided this transitional point in between the two. And finally, we have mill elevators, which is where grain would be processed into flour and packaged or exported in bulk. And sometimes, as I said before, this process was integrated into the terminal elevators. And just looking after harvest, grain had a number of different ways that it could take to its final destination. So here we'll just kind of talk through a couple different options. So for example, grain might be harvested in the field and stored in a farmer's granary, and then brought by wagon to their local cooperative elevator, shipped by train and sold to a sub-terminal, shipped by rail again to a terminal elevator where it would be processed and then put on a barge and exported across the Atlantic. Grain also might go directly to a line elevator, where it would eventually be taken by a train to a regional mill, processed into flour, where it would just go straight to a grocery store and end up as a loaf of bread on someone's dinner table.
As with everything else around the turn of the century, elevator technology was rapidly advancing and regularly trickled down from terminal and mill elevators to country elevators. Entrepreneurs and farmers alike were innovating new ways to increase efficiency in a world where a penny per bushel and improved speed or automation could mean a drastic increase to profits. Going back to elevator function, the first steps of weighing and dumping grain experienced a number of changes over the years. As the use of wagons transitioned to the use of trucks in the first half of the 20th century, a need for more robust scale-up and dumping mechanisms within the drive sheds arose. Larger steel beam scales became commonplace to deal with the larger trucks that could carry upwards of 400 bushels versus the earlier 100 bushel wagons. These scales were balanced in the same way as your typical scale at the doctor's office, using small weights to level the beam. These parts of the mechanism were often located in an office room adjacent to the drive shed, where the manager or bookkeeper could oversee and record the transaction. As for the dumping grain into the pit, early on, wagons would be unloaded by hand with the use of an inclined plane or ramp to assist the flow of grain through the dump grate. Later, wood wagon dumps were used to tilt the contents of the grain into the pit. As the use of trucks became popularized, a better means of unloading was needed, as dropping an underpowered, overloaded truck into low gear and sending it careening at a small hill was neither safe nor efficient. Auto truck dumps and sling hoists were evolutions of early wagon dumps. Later dumps were commonly hydraulic and could lift a 10-ton truck with ease. From the pit, the grain made its way up the leg, which featured cotton belts with metal buckets encased in a wood enclosure. Later on, PVC or rubber belts were used in lieu of cotton, and plastic cups replaced the metal buckets. Early legs could move around 2,000 bushels per hour, while modern legs typically move around double that or even more for larger facilities. Freestanding steel legs were supported by guy wires. This became a standard for new elevators later on. Sometimes they were even extended through existing head houses for support, able to reach annexes that were further away with their additional height. The legs cupped belt was driven by an engine or motor. At first, legs were powered with horses, oxen, or steam, but quickly gasoline and diesel engines took over. Of course, these engines were a major fire hazard operating so close to grain dust, especially when they were located in the head house. Instead, they were often located outside of the elevator in a small shed or the office building with drive belts or chain into the head house. As rural areas were electrified, the conversion to electric motors became commonplace. Distribution from the top of the leg largely remained unchanged. Commonly, elevator operators turned a selector wheel in the workhouse, which rotated a turn head distributor at the head house, sending grain to bins, conveyors, the hopper scale, loading spouts, or other destinations such as grain cleaners. The spouts that carry the grain to these destinations are located at the distribution floor below the head house and between the eaves. Typically, around 1/5 of the elevator was left for working space, and it wasn't uncommon for grain to circulate 3 or more times as it was unloaded, cleaned, sorted, weighed, and loaded into rail cars or trucks. Elevators almost always have swivel spouts for loading rail cars on one side and spouts for loading trucks on the other. One of the most common modifications to elevators was the addition of storage annexes to keep up with ever-increasing harvests. Also, with Montana's late growing seasons, terminal elevators back east were often full and could not accept more grain, which forced Montana elevators to hold their grain until space opened up. Many times the storage took the form of more cribbed bins, telescoping outward from the elevator and using conveyors or augers to transport the grain horizontally. Later, steel bins were commonly added to supplement existing storage. Often a combination of the two were used to expand storage capacity, which gave farmers more flexibility in how they sorted and when they sold their grain. The belt conveyors that moved grain horizontally to these bins were enclosed in an upper cupola. A series of diverters were controlled from below, allowing the operator to select which bins the grain went to. Augers were another solution that provided both horizontal and vertical movement. They were self-enclosed and enabled transport to a broad range of storage types. In addition to the windows that let light in, larger openings on the front or rear of the head house were used to transfer equipment in and out. Commonly, a hoist beam protects above these openings. I think Jared's tall. Technological advances surrounding fire protection, one of the most important changes to early elevators. Grain journals and newspapers reported frequent fires, which often resulted in total loss. Consequently, insurance was one of the highest costs in operating an elevator. The installation of corrugated cladding offered an additional layer of protection from stray sparks. These elevators were known as ironclads. Many times corrugated siding was added over existing clapboard siding, and most later wood elevators were initially built with corrugated siding. Another innovation related to fire prevention was the popularization of dust collectors. Dust collectors sucked out the ambient dust, which mitigated potential fuel sources for fires and reduced the chances of spontaneous combustion. They also greatly improved the working conditions in grain elevators and were increasingly mandated by early labor laws of the 20th century. Another extremely important early innovation was the improvement of foundations and concrete reinforcing. These leaning elevators are a testament to the importance of a good foundation. Other advancements included improvements to man lifts, lightning protection, grain dryers, mixers, and cleaners. These various technologies also trickled down to farms and homesteads as they developed, improving efficiency and automating the storage process. Farmers sometimes even built their own miniature elevators for storing grain and loading it back onto wagons. The Broyer Granary in Kalispell is a notable example of this.
So these early shifts in elevator technology during the first few decades of the 20th century are really overshadowed by some broad sweeping changes to the grain industry and the landscape that occurred mid-century. There were improvements to farming, the highway system, and the decline of the railroads. These are all things that really played a huge role in shaping the future of these early grain elevators. So advancements in planting, harvesting, irrigation, and just about every aspect of farming really made great strides in this era. And this led to larger scale cultivation and really the buying up of a lot of the smaller farms by larger operations just to maintain profit margins. A combination of superior wheat varieties, expanded irrigation, and just simply more efficient equipment immensely improved grain yields during this time. And this really just led to kind of larger scale cultivation and just major improvements in the farming at this time. Right in the early first half of the 20th century, the average yield for spring wheat in Montana was right around 12 bushels an acre. And by the middle of the century, this number had doubled. And today we're seeing yields right around 36 bushels an acre. So pretty huge improvements since the early 20th century. Total grain production in the state jumped from 57 million bushels in 1940 to 117 million bushels in 1958. So that was a doubling of production in the state in a short 18 years. So grain was being harvested faster, more efficiently, and in greater quantities than ever post-war. And that was just putting a lot of strain on the smaller farmers and the smaller elevators. The homesteaders just found it increasingly difficult to compete with these large commercial operations that had the purchasing power to just buy out these large swaths of land from a lot of the early homesteaders themselves, and the purchasing power as well to buy these combines and larger trucks. During this time, there was a pretty major transition from animal to machine, so actual horse-drawn power to horsepower. Contemporary combines, they also eliminated the need for binding and shocking, which drastically reduced that amount of time and labor required during the harvest, although it did create the additional need for drying at the elevators themselves. These new harvest efficiencies combined with the improved crop yields put, as I said, a lot of additional stress on some of these smaller elevators during the condensed harvest seasons. So this is what resulted in a greater need for new storage. And in 1954 to 1958 alone, and just a short 4 years, there was an explosive 32% growth in commercial grain storage capacity in Montana. In addition, a lot of farmers actually just took matters into their own hands and built their own personal storage as well. Truck technology and the road systems also progressed in tandem during this time, both increasing in capacity and efficiency. Trucks went from basically just little combustion powered wagons to 20-ton giants that could cruise at 60 miles an hour. And this 1916 highway map just illustrates some of the proposed national and state highways at the time, which would be realized over the coming decades. And these roads really closely coincided with those existing railroads shown here in blue, and just made trucking a more inexpensive means of moving the grain kind of short to medium distances. And this is really what marked the beginnings of significant change for these early country elevators and their communities as well. So with increased yields and faster transport, there were a lot of unloading lines, and they just became longer and longer. And truck drivers would often just skip that and go to the next elevator to save time or to fetch a better price. And elevators that had the capital to expand their storage and loading capabilities, those are the ones that kind of became the ones that stuck around, while the smaller struggling elevators either went out of business or were bought out by these larger corporations. And as well, sometimes this boom and bust in the elevator industry was actually enough to cause downturns in the communities as well. Ultimately, this change in transportation just became one of the leading factors that contributed to the consolidation of these country elevators. So smaller elevators shifted a lot more toward private storage or were demolished, while every few, maybe every fourth or fifth elevator grew into a larger regional elevator. And this really marked a shift in scale from kind of those early homestead days of horses and wagons where they could only go so far in a day. And elevators at this point in time had officially entered the era of automobility. For elevators to continue to prosper during the shift, they had to undergo a number of changes. So the drive sheds needed to get longer and taller, yet again, to accommodate ever-growing trucks that eventually could hold, over 1,000 bushels each. And the scales as well, of course, needed to be able to handle those trucks and needed increased capacities. More storage annexes and legs were also required to keep up with these deliveries. And eventually, these hopper trailers here that you see here, they eliminated the need for those dumping mechanisms, those dangerous things sort of tipped all the wagons and everything all over the place. And this technology, this hopper technology, was also used by trains, which also got rid of that labor-intensive coopering that we talked about earlier. And development of the highway system and just the popularization of auto travel combined with some overextension of the railroads in the early 20th century resulted in a lot of these smaller rail lines and stuff just being shut down. And with profit margins being tighter than ever, and some of these early wood elevators only capable of slowly filling a handful of train cars a day, it was just infeasible for the trains to continue to stop at every single one. And that was one of the big reasons why a lot of them shut down. It was simply more efficient and profitable to transport grain by truck to these larger collector elevators.
Early wood elevators served their initial purpose of transferring grain from farm to train less and less as time went on. Many of these smaller elevators that dot the countryside became used for private storage rather than a connection to the rail system. As the use of wood elevators declined, steel and concrete elevators were popularized. Although the first steel elevators in the US were built at the end of the 19th century, they didn't become commonplace in Montana until after World War II. These elevators are made up of steel plates, riveted together, and have an external steel leg. They offered superior fire resistance and longevity. With all of their benefits came a few drawbacks. Steel elevators required skilled labor to construct and had issues with rust and moisture. Corrugated galvanized round bins began to be popularized in the 1920s and offered a more inexpensive and easily constructible storage solution. Masonry elevators never really took off in Montana, but a few mills, such as the ones in Harlowton and Harlem, used masonry construction. Concrete elevators developed as early as the end of the 19th century, but became more popular in the first half of the 20th century. Concrete elevators featured a workhouse at one end and a series of cylindrical bins that were fed by conveyors. These bins were commonly over 100 feet high and held upwards of 25,000 bushels each. They were built using slip form construction, where forms would be incrementally slid up as the concrete cured. One large concrete elevator could replace a number of wood elevators. They offered superior fire resistance and storage capacities. Around World War I, insurance costs for elevators were only around 15 to 20% relative to the insurance costs for wood elevators. Before 1941, 96% of country elevators were constructed from wood. In contrast, between 1941 and 1957, only 63% were constructed from wood. Even with the new technologies, wood elevators still provided an inexpensive storage solution and had an advantage when it came to moisture mitigation. With that said, concrete and steel have become the primary methods of construction used today because of their fire resistance and scale.
So Montana's grain elevators come in quite a few different shapes and sizes, and here we just want to touch on a few of kind of the common forms that you'll see around the state. So the familiar kind of early wood elevator form, even as sort of similar as they all are, there are a few variations when you look at them a little more closely. So sometimes the head houses were truncated, kind of lower pitched, or even curved in a few cases. We saw a few examples that were also built with these canted walls on top. I never could figure out a reason why, but that's how they are. Sometimes head houses underwent modifications to accommodate changes to elevator equipment and storage configurations. So in some cases, they grew significantly taller to accommodate changes to elevator equipment and different storage configurations. These changes are commonly visible with a kind of a slight difference in material where the head house was raised up. And later on, as some kind of larger storage capacities were needed, there were some other elevator forms that emerged. So one was this tall kind of parapet roof version that was cribbed just like those earlier wood elevators. So that's all just wood just stacked on top of each other all the way up. Another was the side gable construction, which was also cribbed like the earlier elevators and kind of mimicked an early elevator with storage annexes on the side, but all kind of as a part of the same construction. And beyond form, elevators can also be classified by their capacities. So as we said before, early wood elevators commonly held under 50,000 bushels. Sometimes those annexes were added to increase their capacity up towards 100,000 bushels, while later wood or concrete elevators were built with that much to begin with. And even larger annexes could push capacities well into the hundreds of thousands. And again, some concrete or steel elevators were just built with that much storage right off the bat. And the largest elevators could reach well into the millions of bushels, just dwarfing their early counterparts. And usually we see as architects and folks, we see that buildings are built with a particular style, and that's not really the case with grain elevators. This diamond-shaped window and this barn quilt were really the only signs of ornamentation that we found, across all those elevators that we saw, apart from their signage. And speaking of their signage, a lot of the elevators had this lettering stenciled on to demark the name of the elevator. Sometimes more detailed lettering was painted on, or even the company's logo. And sometimes the signs were just simply applied to the elevators. And of course, grain elevators were also have and continue to be used as billboards by communities. So everything from signs to local bars, to graffiti, to other local signage.
Grain elevators have left a lasting impact on Montana's landscapes. Their enduring legacy tells stories of settlement and progress. Elevators in the communities around them have grown over the years, adapting to changing times. Both have also experienced loss and hardship, relying on each other to persist as the world changed around them. Improved agricultural practices, automobility, the fall of the railroad, globalization, and the consolidation of farms are all things that have shaped elevators and their communities. Times have changed, yet the elevators remain. Their utility has predominantly been consolidated to larger facilities, boasting modern technologies that improve efficiency and safety. Small country elevators are no longer the hubs of activity between field and rail that they once were. When their mechanisms cease to function and the costs of repair outweigh the benefits, local farmers have a hard time justifying upkeep. The cost of repairing elevators or upgrading their equipment to modern commercial standards often exceeds the cost of erecting new steel bins and legs. This, compounded with the difficulty of keeping up with OSHA regulations and the complex economics of grain trade, contributes to the decision to stop using elevators. Disuse begets decay and disrepair, and elevators suffer the effects of time. These cribbed buildings are extremely resilient, but even they have an expiration date after decades of sitting in the elements. Vacant elevators can pose hazards, creating liabilities for railroad companies and owners to mitigate. With few able or willing to step in, many times this trajectory ultimately ends in demolition.
But sometimes demolition was not the end of the story. Although the demand for smaller country elevators has waned over time, creative and passionate folks have found ways to save these incredible landmarks. And elevators across the US have been adapted for a variety of different uses. Adaptation, though, of these structures does not come without its challenges. That internal cribbing that provided that nice structure to hold the grain makes opening up the floor plan pretty impractical without major structural changes. The lack of windows, egress stairs, fire resistant construction, and other elements that you commonly see in other building types also complicate reuse. And these structures, really, they're not blank slates like a warehouse or commercial building that you'd see in other adaptive reuse cases. They have an inherent function that's tied to their very core. So, of course, cost is always another consideration when you're looking at adapting an elevator. Painting, re-roofing, and some minor structural upgrades might be reasonable things to cover with local fundraising, but full adaptation of these structures into a different use proves rather difficult without external grants or developer backing. And so the following stories that I'll just breeze through here quick demonstrate just a few examples of communities giving new life to their elevators. So a number have been converted into various types of businesses, including this elevator in Red Lodge, which currently houses chiropractic and massage offices. The Misco Mill in Bozeman has been converted into a gallery, workshop, and short-term rental property. And here in Missoula, the Saratana grain elevator was adapted into Saratana Studios, which currently houses a gallery, makerspace, and artist studios. Over the border to the south, down in Wyoming, we have Sheridan Flouring Mills, which even had a portion of the mill converted into a hotel. And perhaps the most fitting adaptive reuse of the elevator typology, center of gravity rock gym in Wichita Falls, Texas, used the climbing bins, or the bins as climbing routes, and the head house actually hosts all the belay equipment. Siloville in Eco, Texas, and Upper Limits in Bloomington, Illinois also use this model. So inserting a recreational use into the utilitarian form of grain elevators. Continuing to look outside the state, a number of mills and elevators have also been turned into museums. So this is Minneapolis's Mill City Museum, which is an incredibly stunning adaptation of the mill that hosts a number of exhibits relating to milling and the grain industry. Alberta's Spruce Grove Museum curates some of their local history within the elevator. And the Plum Coulee Elevator Museum up in Manitoba also exhibits some of the building's agricultural past and some of the other community artifacts that they've collected. In other cases, some owners have adapted their structures into homes, as in the case of this elevator in Anthony. So you can see their old deck coming off the back there. And as well, this elevator in Big Sag, they appear to have converted the little office on the side there into a guest cabin. And of course, we see a lot of these steel bin homes kind of scattered around the state. But often, the first step to reusing elevators is just simply preserving them. This remarkable grassroots effort at Livingston's Tesla elevator, it halted demolition, then made repairs to the damaged head house, purchased the building, they created a nonprofit and gave the Tesla a new roof on that order. And the future of the stabilized Tesla continues to be imagined by the community, but it's really championed to become a cool and vibrant community space. Over in Hobson, following reports of some safety concerns and subsequent demolition planning by BNSF, the community promptly put together a stabilization plan within the 6-month stay of demolition and raised enough funds to preserve this pair of elevators. Placed on the National Register in 1996, Bozeman's Story Mill represents a pretty important chapter of Bozeman's past. And after a mixed-use development fell through in the early 2000s, the Trust for Public Land actually acquired this property and turned it into Story Mill Community Park, which includes a restored wetland, and further development at the site continues to be explored today. And when all else fails and an elevator is inevitably going to be torn down, salvage is still a somewhat bearable option. Salvage material can be used to repair other elevators or construct new structures and just kind of continue a small piece of that story.
Used or unused, shiny or weathered, Montana's grain elevators remain iconic figures in the landscape, punctuating road trips across the plains and recalling a bygone era. These local landmarks stand as symbols of pride in their communities, as evidenced by these incredible preservation efforts. Beyond their local and regional importance as utilitarian vessels for agricultural commerce, elevators have inspired creatives with their simple forms and honest expression of function. These magnificent first fruits of the new age attracted the attention of early modernist architects such as Le Corbusier, shaping the modernist movement and architecture as we know it today. Artists and photographers have also been drawn to these picturesque structures, with notable names like Walter J. Phillips and George Campbell Tinning having depicted grain elevators. We were also drawn to these structures by their magnetic charm. As part of our field work, we spent time drawing and painting to better understand and appreciate the simple but nuanced form of Montana's grain elevators. In conclusion, grain elevators, although sometimes disused and discarded, remain an incredibly important building type within Montana's agricultural landscapes. They initially provided a primary means for homesteaders to make an income and prosper in Montana, but are now valued in different ways by locals and passerby. These structures still serve an important purpose to communities, even if not in use. They embody and recall local narratives of community and everyday life, regional narratives of agriculture, national narratives of westward expansion, and global narratives of grain trade. As elevators and those who can tell their stories are lost, pieces of these narratives disappear with them. Of course, we can't save them all, but collectively, as preservationists and lovers of history, we need to ensure that communities are equipped with the tools they need for the grassroots preservation of these incredible landmarks. Grain elevators are not your typical candidates for adaptation that catch developers or investors' eyes. Their preservation needs to start from the community. Elevators are probably one of the most important building types to central Montana, and conversely are probably one of the hardest to preserve. With a little determination and a lot of passion, these buildings can once again serve as the point of bringing communities together.
So now that you all know way more than you ever thought you wanted to know about grain elevators, we'll take any questions that you'll have.
So the cribbing type of construction, what were they, 2x6s or what were they?
Depending on the size of the elevator. There a lot of them I think were either 2x10 or 2x8 on the bottom, and then they kind of went to 2x6 and 2x4 for like the upper third or so. Sometimes the head houses were just framed, stud framed, but yeah, the actual crib or the actual bins were all cribbed. And I guess that's what you needed to kind of resist all that pushing outward of that grain after it's stacked up 100 feet high. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. It's a lot of wood.
I'm curious how often during your survey did you show up to find that it had been demolished?
I don't know. It was 1 in 10, maybe, roughly. Yeah. Yeah, it was a lot of them. And these were ones that we had just found mostly on like Google Earth, like some of them we knew they were demolished like before, but yeah, there were quite a few where we're like, yeah, this was exciting. Like we went on Street View and we're looking at them and, so they had disappeared within like the last 5 years or so. So yeah, it was kind of sad. And that one that we saw with the backhoe, like that one was being taken down. They hauled the scale away when we were there. Yeah, they're disappearing fast.
I suspect that lumber in the old silos is old growth lumber. So
yeah, a lot of it probably
a profit motive to take them down.
Yeah, there's a couple companies up in Canada that that's all they do. They tear down grain elevators. I think they kind of chainsaw the bins up, and yeah, they have those machines that pull the nails out automatically or whatever, and yeah, sell it off.
Big enemy of preservation.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's better to see it reused than just put in a pile and burned. So yeah, Jennifer.
Couple things, I don't know if you know, there's a grain storage building at Long Branch. So.
Yeah,
and then I did a retrofit on a grain elevator like 20 years ago. I don't even remember, it must be balloon framed.
Okay.
But a friend of mine bought it in Landon, Wyoming, because it was gonna be torn down, and he put a timber frame in it and called his wife a yoga studio. She like teaches yoga. So I'll get some pictures if you want.
Yeah, that'd be really cool to see. Yeah, those balloon framed ones were interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I assume that I don't really remember. I just did the timber frame part of it.
Yeah.
No.
That's probably the only way that you'd be able to do much in one without getting rid of the cribbing. Yeah, those balloon frame ones, yeah, they were just studs, and then they had those big timbers around. And then
I'm assuming it's, I went there and I don't really remember, it was so long ago. Like I said, I just designed some timber frame stuff. So,
cool.
So see if I can get some photos.
Yeah.
Is your presentation going to be available digitally or some way those of us who want to follow up with all this information you threw at us?
Yeah, I think it will.
We recorded it.
Yeah.
We'll send it.
Okay.
just where you can get that.
Yeah, I've been all over Montana, photographed a number of those I've seen here,
Yeah,
some that I haven't, always wondered. Yeah, I mean, that map alone, just of the locations, is pretty stunning.
yeah, they were everywhere, yeah. Yeah, every 5 to 10 miles, pretty much along any rail line in Montana. There's one or more in every town.
Yeah.
I have more comment. While we have so many people interested in preservation in one place and hear about the need to preserve these things and opportunities, to look into the Historic Preservation Fund and the ways in which it can be used by communities, grants to preserve things like these grain elevators, and see how important that is to all of our communities right now, because we are in a moment of looking whether or not it'll be funded.
So did you follow up at all on the current forms of storage and transport? Because you know they have huge railroad loops now,
Yeah,
where they can continuously load car after car and hundred car long trains.
yeah, a lot of those new elevators outside Great Falls have those, yeah, and yeah, they'll just stack up a bunch of train cars and yeah, just keep circulating them, loading them up. Yeah, and that also gives them a lot of flexibility too for different types of grain and for different grades of wheat or flour, I guess.
Great.
Well, yeah, if that's all the questions, thank y'all for coming out. And, yeah. What else is happening in Preservation Month? There's not many days left.
It's done.
There's Saturday, there's the opening of the barracks out at the fort, a new exhibit that I know Kayla helped put together, called her out. So yeah, Kayla, what time is that?
It is at noon, but the building will be part of the permanent exhibitions at the port. So as long as the grounds buildings are open, it will be available. It looks like a construction site, which is very misleading. There is a building next to the construction site that will be open.
And I know Preserve Historic Missoula will be announcing the 11 most endangered buildings list. I think probably early June. I don't think we'll quite make May here, but that would be on the lookout for that. I think that'll be dispersed in a few different venues. So yeah, thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Everyone comes back to the